Jeffrey Epstein, a name that would one day dominate headlines across the world. But before the scandals, before the arrests, before the conspiracy theories, he was a man shrouded in mystery. A financier with no college degree, no Wall Street pedigree, and yet he climbed into the highest circles of wealth and power. The question is, how Epstein was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1953. The son of working-class parents, his early life gave no indication of the empire he would one day build. He attended college but never graduated. Still, he possessed something far more valuable than a diploma: an uncanny ability to persuade, to impress, and to make people believe he belonged in their world. In the 1970s, Epstein began as a math teacher at the Dalton School, an elite private academy in Manhattan. It was here, surrounded by the sons and daughters of New York's wealthy, that he learned the importance of connections. Parents noticed him, businessmen noticed him. One of them would change the course of his life forever. Alan Greenberg, the head of the investment bank Bear Stearns, was introduced to Epstein through one of those wealthy families. Despite lacking formal qualifications, Epstein talked his way into a job at the prestigious firm. It was here that his talent for networking and risk came alive. He handled clients with charm. He promised results others couldn't, and most of all, he built relationships, powerful ones. By the 1980s, Epstein had left Bear Stearns to strike out on his own. His new firm, J. Epstein & Co. was selective, so selective in fact that he claimed to only manage money for billionaires. Few knew exactly what he did or how he did it, but those who came into his orbit described the same thing: a man who seemed to appear out of nowhere, yet always had access to wealth beyond comprehension. His fortune grew. His homes multiplied: New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, even a private island in the Caribbean. His friendships extended to royalty, politicians, tech giants, and business magnates. Jeffrey Epstein was no longer just a financier. He was becoming a figure of influence, a gatekeeper to the powerful. But behind the glittering facade of wealth, something darker was already taking root. His rise was not built only on charm and business skill. It was built on secrets. And secrets, when guarded too tightly, always come at a cost. This was the rise of Jeffrey Epstein, a man who came from nowhere and stepped into everywhere. But power is never without a price. By the late 1980s and 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein was no longer just a financier. He was a man of connections. He cultivated a network so vast, so influential, that it would come to define his power, and later his downfall. Epstein's social circle was a who's who of the rich and powerful. Billionaires, politicians, royalty, celebrities. From Wall Street to Washington, from Hollywood to Buckingham Palace, his reach seemed limitless. But how did a man with no traditional background, no clear source of fortune, gain such access? Part of Epstein's genius lay in his ability to mirror those around him. He listened, he adapted. He presented himself as exactly what people wanted him to be. To some, he was a brilliant financial advisor. To others, a trusted confidant. And to many, he was simply the man who always knew someone more powerful than you did. He surrounded himself with luxury: mansions in Manhattan and Palm Beach, a sprawling ranch in New Mexico, and most infamously, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. These places weren't just symbols of wealth, they were stages. Stages where Epstein played host, where powerful men and women mingled, where alliances were forged in secrecy. His private jet became legendary. Nicknamed by the press as the Lolita Express, it ferried guests across the world. Business leaders to academics, politicians, each flight another knot in Epstein's growing web of influence. And always there was an air of exclusivity. To be invited into Epstein's world was to feel chosen, special. But with that privilege came risk, because those who entered often found themselves bound by secrets. Epstein understood the psychology of power. True power was not just wealth, it was information. And information carefully kept could be used like currency. Some say this was the real secret to his influence: the knowledge he held about others. Knowledge that could destroy reputations or protect them. By the early 2000s, Epstein's network reached into the highest echelons of society. From presidents to princes, his associations raised eyebrows, but rarely questions. Few dared to challenge him, few wanted to, because in Epstein's world, access to him often meant access to something greater: money, connections, or status. And so the circle grew tighter and darker. Behind the elegant dinners and the grand estates, another story was unfolding. A story of exploitation, secrecy, and crimes hidden in plain sight. The network of power was more than just a social ladder. It was a shield. And behind that shield, Jeffrey Epstein began to commit acts that would eventually shake the world. By the mid-2000s, Jeffrey Epstein's carefully crafted world began to unravel. What was once hidden behind gates, private jets, and luxury estates started to draw scrutiny. For years, he had lived in a sphere of privilege, surrounded by wealth, power, and connections that seemed untouchable. But whispers were growing louder. At first, they were only rumors, stories exchanged in hushed tones, odd details noticed by reporters who sensed something was wrong but could not yet prove it. Then came the first public investigations. Quiet at first, but impossible to ignore once they began to surface. When formal charges were filed, the public was stunned. Epstein's name was now tied to controversy that reached far beyond gossip columns. The charges threatened to reveal not just his actions, but the fragile structure of power that had protected him for so long. And yet the results left many bewildered. After months of negotiation, Epstein faced a legal deal that felt to outside eyes remarkably lenient. His sentence was lighter than many expected, and questions emerged almost immediately. Why did such serious accusations result in such minimal punishment? Who had pulled the strings? To many, this case was no longer just about one man. It was about the system itself. The scandal sparked a debate across the nation. Some argued that wealth and status had allowed Epstein to navigate justice in ways ordinary citizens could never imagine. Others believed the case exposed deep flaws within institutions meant to protect the vulnerable. For the public, it was a test of trust. Could they believe in a justice system where outcomes seemed to change depending on who stood trial? Could they ignore the influence of money and power when the evidence pointed toward something far more complicated? Meanwhile, the media frenzy escalated. Headlines splashed across front pages. Television anchors repeated the story night after night, and the world's attention turned toward Epstein's mysterious fortune, his circle of associates, and the reach of his influence. Each revelation pulled more people into the storm, suggesting that the scandal was bigger than one person. It was a web. But webs can be fragile. Pull one thread and the entire structure threatens to collapse. For Epstein, survival seemed to come not just from wealth, but from the power of association. The more names linked to him, the murkier the picture became. Who knew what and when? How deep did his connections run? Every answer seemed to create two more questions. Every document raised new doubts, and every courtroom appearance felt less like closure and more like a staged performance. As the scandal unfolded, trust eroded further. Some viewed Epstein as a manipulator who had used his fortune as a shield. Others saw him as a symbol of something larger, a glimpse into a system where influence mattered more than truth. The scandal revealed more than Epstein's secrets. It revealed how fragile institutions become when power and money enter the equation. This was no longer just the story of a wealthy financier. It had become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about society, privilege, and accountability. And while Epstein seemed for a time to emerge with his empire intact, the pressure was mounting. Whispers were no longer whispers. They were headlines, investigations, and relentless questions that refused to go away. The storm was growing, and storms always break. By the late 2010s, Jeffrey Epstein's carefully protected world finally collapsed. He was arrested once again under far greater scrutiny. The storm he had escaped years earlier now returned in full force, and it was global. For weeks, the headlines never stopped. But the story was no longer about wealth or mystery. It was about the people who had lived in the shadows of his influence, many of them just girls at the time. The media gave them space. Survivors of Epstein's world shared their experiences. Their words were difficult but necessary. "He stole my childhood," one voice said, clear and trembling. "I was 14. He took that, and you can't ever get it back." Another voice, filled with cold anger, stated, "This wasn't just one man. It was a network. They all knew. Everyone in that circle knew what was happening to teenage girls. For too long, their stories had been whispers. Now they were broadcast to millions, a chorus of resolve from years of being ignored. And in those voices, the public began to understand the true weight of the scandal, the systematic abuse of children. It was no longer an abstract case. It was human, it was painful. The testimonies became central. Each interview deepened the outrage, reminding the world that this was more than the downfall of a financier. "They tell you you're special for so long," a survivor explained, "that you start to believe it. Speaking out is how I take that power back from the man who groomed me as a child. And yet Epstein himself remained an enigma. But the tide was different now. The stories of those who spoke out grew louder. For the first time it seemed he might truly face justice. But then an ending no one expected. Weeks into his custody, the announcement came. Epstein was gone. The shock was immediate. For the survivors, it felt like a door had slammed shut. "He doesn't get to stand trial," one said, her voice a mix of fury and grief. "He took the coward's way out, and we're the ones left with no closure for what he did to us as kids." For the public, it was a moment of disbelief. How could such a high-profile figure under such close watch suddenly no longer be alive? And so the story did not end, it fractured. The survivors, who had finally found their voices, were left with unfinished chapters. The world was left to wonder, had justice been served or had it been stolen from those who had already lost their youth? Jeffrey Epstein's fall was not just the collapse of one man. It was the collision of secrecy, privilege, and the voices of those who refused to stay silent. And though his story ended in a cell, the echoes of those voices, raw, courageous, and true, would carry far beyond the walls that confined him. When the news of Jeffrey Epstein's death spread, it did not bring clarity. It brought chaos. For some, it was an ending. For many, it was the beginning of a new storm, one fueled by suspicion, doubt, and the haunting feeling that the full story had slipped away. The survivors who had spoken out were left with unfinished chapters. Their courage had put Epstein back in the public eye, but his sudden death cut short the chance to see him face every question in court. The sense of justice remained incomplete, and with it, frustration grew. In the months that followed, speculation spread faster than any courtroom testimony could. How could a man so high-profile, so closely watched, die under such circumstances? Reports offered explanations, but each line raised more questions than answers. Online forums filled with theories. Television panels debated endlessly. Even world leaders hinted at disbelief. And so Epstein's story transformed once again from scandal to trial to mystery. At its heart, the story was no longer just about one man. It became about systems of power, the fragility of institutions, and the shadows that exist where influence outweighs accountability. The names tied to Epstein's network fueled endless curiosity. Who knew what? How deep did the web go? Some documents were unsealed, revealing connections and details, but much remained sealed, hidden behind legal walls. To the public, it felt like staring at a puzzle with missing pieces. And that may be the lasting legacy of Jeffrey Epstein. Not the luxury, not even the scandal, but the unanswered questions that still hang in the air. What really happened in those final hours? What secrets vanished with him? And how many truths remain locked away, waiting in silence? For survivors, the fight did not end. Their stories pushed for new conversations about accountability, power, and protection. They reminded the world that behind every headline, there were human lives changed forever. For society, the case became a mirror, a reminder of how wealth and influence can bend the rules, a warning of how fragile justice can appear when privilege stands in its way. Epstein's rise and fall remains one of the most unsettling tales of modern times. A man who lived in luxury walked among the powerful, and then fell into disgrace, only for his final chapter to raise more questions than it answered. But history does not end with neat conclusions. Sometimes it ends with silence, sometimes with suspicion, and sometimes with the haunting knowledge that truth itself may never be fully known.